last time Ken was here, he spoke on St. Louis corporations that no longer exist, which was a request we made and did a wonderful job. Ken is a native, a New York native. He's been here with us in St. Louis for about 40 years. He's a graduate of the State University of New York in Binghamton, holds a master's in social work from University of Pennsylvania. He is the immediate past CEO of our local Jewish Community Center. He is an avid history buff, no surprise, and currently volunteers with a nonprofit, the Kaufman Fund. Today, Ken will speak on why the U.S. and her allies won World War II. Please, thank you, Mary, always reminding me, turn off your phones. Thank you.
Thank you, Vi. Wow, almost standing room only. Hello, everyone at Mason Point, and it is a pleasure to be back here. The subject is near and dear to me, on a terrible subject because it's war, and 70 million people around the world lost their lives during that 6-year period from 1939 to 1945. But nevertheless, it was the war that literally shaped the world that I grew up in, and for many of you as well. And I'm going to open up with a question. How many of you in the room are either veterans or were married to veterans, have veterans as brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, veterans in your family and in your lives to this point? Raise your hand. Virtually everyone. Wow. Did I hear World War I? Way too young. But in any case, my father, I was telling, what is your name, sir? Dan? Yeah, I was speaking with Dan just a moment ago. My father was 28 years old when he was drafted in 1942 in my hometown of Buffalo, New York, to be in the Army Air Corps, and ended up, he served in the European theater from 43 to 45. He followed literally the path of the Army, going in over the Channel, and then from D-Day on, going through northern France, Belgium. He and his regiment were caught on the ground at the beginning of the Battle of the Bulge, and then, thank God, he and most of his friends survived and made it to Berlin during the surrender of May of 1945. So I grew up. I was born in 1950, 5 years right at the end of the war. And so, which at that time, and you'll remember, World War II was not a forgotten subject. I could go to a college campus, so could you today, and ask an undergraduate, what was World War II? And many people would say something fought in the 13th century. No, it wasn't. It was fought in either our lifetimes or, in my case, just before. But I had uncles, my dad, my aunts were living in fear that their husbands, my uncles, wouldn't come back, and mother's friends, and the like. So, and what makes this presentation relevant in the timing, and I was speaking to Vi and Jen a few moments ago, we're in the midst of a very heated presidential election and congressional elections. The entire House of Representatives is up, and a third of the Senate. And very much like the years preceding World War II, which we're going to get into in a moment, the country is divided now about the role, our role in the world as a country, the role of the military, and what could it or should it be? Well, we're going to learn together, and I'm going to want you to interrupt me. If I'm incorrect on something, tell me that. And if you want a little bit more background, holler. Alrighty? But we talk about a divided country. Let's take a look at where we were, how America responded to war. Germany invades Poland on September 1st, 1939. And at that point, France and England, who had treaties of mutual support with Poland, declared war on Germany the very next day. We did not respond as an ally of Poland at that time. Why? Because at the end of World War I, the United States opposed President Woodrow Wilson, the United States Senate, and defeated our entry into the League of Nations. Remember, that was the body that ultimately did become the current UN, or United Nations, but America wanted, and your parents may have spoken about this, relatives, a return to normalcy after World War I, which American involvement was only 17 months, but yet we lost 110,000 soldiers, primarily in France. Missouri's only president, Harry S. Truman of Independence, Missouri, he fought bravely in combat, came in as a private, and left as a captain without any college education. Truman was smart, he was brave, and he was a great Missouri representative in World War I. And his experiences and knowing what dictators and frankly bad actors can do influenced his thinking after President Franklin Delano Roosevelt died. So, on the European portion of the war, we were neutral. But there was another war that was going on, and that had to do with Imperial Japan. Remember, Japan was not a democracy. It had an emperor who for many centuries was never seen or even heard by his population. And it was a young emperor, Hirohito, who actually survived to the late 1970s. I remember Hirohito as a kid for decades after the war. We'll get into that a little while. But the Japanese had evolved into, they were victors militarily in a brutal war with Russia in 1906 for land bordering on Manchuria. Japanese created a navy and army within a 50-year period that was among the greatest fighting forces we had ever seen. But sadly, their army was not meant for merely defense or to maintain peaceful relationships. They wanted the Western Pacific to be a Japanese lake. Japan, in many ways, is a beautiful country. However, it lacks the natural resources that, particularly in the early part of the 20th century, was so critical. And what was the most important natural resource Japan coveted?
Oil.
Oil, black gold, Texas tea, all right? And Japan did not produce an ounce of oil in its homelands. But yet, 1,000 miles away in the Dutch East Indies, now primarily Indonesia, was rich oil fields, wealthy, and there were huge natural resources in an old and hated enemy, China, which was weak militarily. It was still a feudal country that had largely refused to modernize through its various emperors and feudal leaders. The Chinese were primarily an agricultural economy, but they had abundant resources that Japan wanted. And in 1937, the Japanese invaded China. A terrible, merciless invasion, where not only were resources gathered, but thousands, into the millions of native Chinese were killed. That was the beginning of the 1940s for America. You had two wars raging, Japan and China, and Japan wanting to take over colonies that were owned primarily by the French and Great Britain. Fortress Singapore, Great Britain. Hong Kong, Great Britain. French Indochina, which we learned in the 1960s had a different name, Vietnam, where a seminal event in my young adulthood. That was all part of the Japanese master plan to take Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific to make it its own. And a Japanese war cabinet headed by General Tojo took command in the mid-1930s and made Japan one of the three greatest military powers on earth. And they were merciless as they moved forward. Now, Britain, all alone in Europe by June of 1940. The French, supposedly the greatest army on earth, after declaring war on Germany, Germany decides to eliminate France as a warring power. The French had created what was called the Maginot Line. After World War I, a series of forts along the French-German frontier, from the North Sea to the Baltic Sea. And what did the Germans do with their Panzer Division, meaning the advanced tanks? They simply went around those fortresses with amazing ease. Where they invaded in January of 40, Paris fell in June of 1940. And Adolf Hitler and hundreds of thousands of German troops paraded through Paris in June of 1940, which would be Nazi-dominated for the next 4 years. England was alone. But we shared a common heritage. Roosevelt was enamored with England and the British people. His ancestors had been of British blood as well as Dutch blood. And the new Prime Minister, Winston Spencer Churchill, had a special relationship with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And they worked out an amazing arrangement that an isolationist Congress finally passed, and that was called Lend-Lease. Britain had certain small territories south of Florida in the Caribbean that they gave willingly to the U.S. But what the U.S. did was to give ships excess naval armaments to the British, which were huge for them, as they were about to embark on the Battle of Britain, fearing a naval invasion by Germany. But God bless the Brits, they had created the Royal Air Force, beginning during World War I, that stopped the Germans in their tracks from invading England in the spring, summer, and fall of 1940. So England stood alone, but she stood as a free and independent country without succumbing the way France had. All righty, let's see what we can do here. And I have lost the screen.
It goes to sleep.
It goes to sleep. All right, well, I'll be a little more active on the clicker. Did you hear about the fire in the shoe factory? A real heel started it. Oh, and I'll tell you, they're a tough crowd. And worse than that, 1,000 souls were lost. Oh, tough crowd, tough crowd. All right, now, China begged for U.S. assistance in the Pacific. Britain and France, well, Britain and the Free French wanted to try to hold on to their colonial possessions. And the United States feared that the Japanese had expansion plans that would include Hawaii and the western portion of our United States. So what the U.S. did was literally embargoed Japanese oil supplies that came from those areas that were not controlled by the U.S. Thank God, back as early as the 1920s, the United States built what became the greatest navy this country the world had ever seen. The world had ever seen. The Japanese, though, were angry, frustrated, and saw their plans to dominate the Western Pacific literally being washed ashore without oil. Oil has been the wonder of our existence, but yet the bane of our existence for too long. Now, so what did Japan plan to do? They felt in order to reign supreme in the Pacific, they had to neutralize, not conquer the United States. Their plans were never to set up literally an office in downtown St. Louis and control our lives. They wanted to control their half of the Pacific Ocean. But the United States stood in its way. And despite months of negotiations, the United States was holding firm that unless Japan stopped its aggressive activities in China and in the Dutch East Indies, French Indochina, Singapore, the British possessions, the embargo would hold. So, what does Japan decide to do? Destroy the American fleet as much as possible and delay America's military power literally till 1943. And what it did, it crafted a secret plan of launching a fleet from the Northwest Pacific all the way southeasterly to Hawaii. And the United States was asleep at the wheel at that point. We had the capacity, but there were breakdowns in the ability to spot this fleet and hundreds of Japanese Zero airplanes that could bomb from the air and could send torpedoes in the sea to destroy American battleships and the 4 great aircraft carriers that were based at Pearl Harbor. Well, America, which had been split on Saturday, December 6th, about staying at peace, staying out of foreign wars, on December 8th, we were united. Suddenly, we were at war. Now, I had mentioned Germany, Adolf Hitler, a critical tactical mistake on his part. Hitler had a treaty with Japan and Germany that if with Japan and Germany, with Japan and Italy, the Axis powers, that if one went to war, all would go to war. Very similar to our current arrangement with NATO, the North America Treaty Alliance. Very similar, except on a much larger scale. Well, Germany declared war on the United States. And suddenly, we were in a world war. But now, the Congress united behind Roosevelt and his administration, and industrialists, the Henry Fords, the Kaiser Shipbuilding Company, the Carnegie and then later U.S. Steel Corporation, DuPont, and on to create the arsenal of democracy. President Roosevelt, a year before, had said, although we want to remain peaceful and not be engaged in a foreign war, we have to be that arsenal of democracy. Now, Japan, on December 8th, 1941, literally controlled half the Pacific Ocean, from Hawaii west to the middle of China and south to French Indochina. But a very consequential decision may have cost them victory in the medium run in the war. Yes, they destroyed battleships after or severely damaged almost all U.S. battleships in the Pacific that were docked on a sleepy but beautiful Sunday, December 7th. But our aircraft carriers that day were not at Pearl Harbor. The Enterprise. And by the way, we have a certain rental car company named after that great aircraft carrier, because the founder of our rental car company, Jack Taylor, was a seaman first class on that ship. And we live today with the legacy of his passion for the Navy and wanting to honor the ship that literally became his life for 4 years in service to our country. The Taylor family. Maybe the most philanthropic family we have seen in St. Louis of the last 40 years. That's a sidebar to remember. But the Yorktown, the Enterprise, and 2 other great carriers were on maneuvers away from Pearl Harbor. The Japanese did not know that. And Admiral Yamamoto, the planner of the Pearl Harbor invasion, felt, and despite all the glory that was put upon him, and the exultation of the Japanese people that they had destroyed the United States Navy, he knew that by not getting those aircraft carriers, which could fight on literally the sea and in the air that the United States had been awoken. Yamamoto said, some may think we've had a great victory. We've only had a partial victory. We have awoken a sleeping tiger. That was from Yamamoto. And those Japanese Zeros were built by a very established and wealthy Japanese auto company. Now, they were Mitsubishi. Right, I know. Hey, you know something? We're 80 years beyond, 75, 80 years beyond, but Mitsubishi produced among the greatest fighter planes ever made for combat warfare. But they were no match to our B-17s, B-12s, C-47s made by the Boeing company. We had the great Lockheed Aircraft Company, McDonnell Air Force, Douglas Air Force, and Boeing that created the greatest Air Force on Earth by the end of 1945. And Japan fails to eliminate the aircraft carriers. And then, 15 minutes. Remember I said the war lasted 6 years. But there was one 15-minute period that changed world history and the course of World War II forever. Now, Japan wanted to strike a second fatal blow against the U.S. Navy. They knew aircraft carriers by then had survived. It's 6 months after Pearl Harbor. And west of Hawaii was an atoll called Midway Island, an island atoll. One big island, almost uninhabited, but it was suitable for a U.S. Air Force base, and it had a good harbor, and the Japanese were mounting an invasion, both on land and sea. But the United States by then, with the help of the British, who literally invented this wonderful tracking source called radar. And we had wonderful cryptologists. And our cryptologists in the spring of 1942 broke the Japanese code. And we knew when the Japanese carriers and where they were going to be and when they were supposedly going to attack Midway Island. We got to the Japanese first. And what happened was, literally on June 6, 1942, suddenly, amidst stormy and cloudy skies, there was an opening of the sky like we've had today amidst the torrential rains. And one American pilot, Frank Gay, radioed and said, we've got Japanese aircraft carriers right below us. Can we attack? He asked his commanders. And the commanders said yes. And within 15 minutes, we had either sunk or severely damaged the heart of the Japanese carrier force. And as I say, Japan, we lost one carrier a day later, the Yorktown, but Japan was crippled. They were never, ever able to replace those lost carriers. We replaced the Yorktown, and our carriers lived and fought the balance of the Pacific War, and Japan never regained the offensive that had begun in 1937, and they lost that forever in 1942. But they wouldn't surrender quickly or easily. Now, Germany. Germany, by 1941, literally controlled all of Europe, or all of the western half of Europe. But Hitler hated Russia. He hated Slavic peoples. He hated Jews. He hated Slavics, of all Catholics and Protestants. Anyone from the countries like Bulgaria, Hungary, Poland, and the Russian Soviet Union, he despised, wanted to eliminate them. And what he did, he decided to turn on his erstwhile ally, Joseph Stalin, and attack Russia. So on June 22nd, 1941, Hitler unleashes 2 million men, tanks, trucks, airplanes, the terrible Luftwaffe, on the Soviet Union. And they made amazing progress, right up to the Moscow suburbs. But Hitler and his generals failed to account for one huge factor. The weather. That's right, the Russian winter. And that was no global warming winter of 1941-42 by any means or stretch. And literally on the gates of Moscow, the German army got bogged down because their superiors back in Berlin had failed to properly give their soldiers boots, the appropriate boots, jackets, hats, and gloves. And thousands of German soldiers in December, January, and February froze to death. Not taking bullets, but literally froze to death. And what Hitler did not account for was the combined population of the United States, Britain, and France was superior in numbers and ultimately superior in their desire to retain their democracy and their countries. So Hitler reigned supreme in Western Europe, but by February of 1942, he had stalled out. Principal reason why Germany failed. And with Japan preoccupied in the Pacific and Italy showing itself as a fourth-rate military power that was virtually useless, Hitler was all alone among the Axis powers. Germany's failures, we talked about. Their population was 52 million. The United States, by the entry of World War I, we had 130 million. Add Britain's 50 million. France, although under German control, you had a brilliant French underground. In occupied France, especially Paris, they gave vital information to the Allies that led to our success on the Normandy invasion 2 years after the Battle of Midway on June 6, 1944. Germany underestimated the industrial and intellectual expertise and the quality of Allied arms. Germany hated intellectuals, he hated Jews, and those that were able to escape the concentration and death camps largely made it to the United States. And among the turning points of the war was the creation of the atomic bomb, and radar, and weaponry that were far beyond what the Germans or Japanese could create on their own. We became the intellectual powerhouse of the world because particularly of Hitler's hatred. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the son of Jewish immigrants, the father of the hydrogen bomb, Edward Teller, a Hungarian Jew, Niels Bohr, Jewish, and on because of Hitler's hatred of Jews that never bothered them. They fought bravely on the German side in World War I. I knew, living at the JCC campus, I knew a Jewish World War I German soldier. But when Germany turned its hatred on the Jews in the 30s, he escaped to America, ended up in St. Louis, and in 1941, after Pearl Harbor, enlisted in the American Army and ended up fighting Germany. True story. And this gentleman, Mr. Kahn, was not alone. He lived until the late 1990s, by the way. A World War I proud German soldier. Who knows? He could have served with Hitler, who was a corporal. But in 1941, he was a true blue American. Now, General of the Army Dwight David Eisenhower, the man from Abilene, one of 5 brothers, poor as a church mouse, wanted a college education to not have to work on a farm or attend a country grocery store. And the one place you could get a free college education was in the West Point or Annapolis or New London for the Coast Guard. Eisenhower was able to pass the entrance exam to West Point, but he had to take time and work to support his family. He was among the oldest applicants ever to be accepted to West Point. He was 29 years old as a freshman plebe. And he was a lackadaisical student in history, not history, but in English and foreign languages, but brilliant in math and engineering. And Eisenhower never fought in World War I. He was valued as a trainer of tank operations and early aircraft, and he was stateside during World War I. But during the war, he became noted as one of the great tacticians in the peacetime Army. And he went to the Army War College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, which, again, was superior to what the Germans and Japanese had. Our country had amazing expertise above and beyond West Point and Annapolis to train soldiers in peacetime, and Eisenhower was a beneficiary of that. Well, British intelligence. A few minutes ago, I praised the Brits for creating radar. They had amazing spycraft and intelligence outside of London in Bletchley Park, England. And Germany, again, by Hitler's desire to be Julius Caesar, overextended its military resources not only in Russia, but in North Africa, again, in a hunger for North African oil. Well, why? And I'm going to be finishing up and then open it up for questions. You've been a very patient group. A majority of the world's best scientists we just talked about were forced out of Germany due to anti-Semitism. And the United States was that beacon of democracy that welcomed them. Japan did not have the oil resources to sustain its Army, Navy, and Air Force. Japan retreated in all the terrible Pacific Island battles of 42, 43, 44, Okinawa, Siam, Iwo Jima, Guam, and on, where they fought savagely, but were defeated at each step of the way. And Germany failed in its efforts to produce its own atomic bombs, but they led the way in missile developments. Those terrible V-2 rockets that at near the end of the war were able to be launched from the Netherlands and struck London, among others, the first guided missiles. Germany did have that expertise, but Hitler did not have the scientists who could successfully create, thank God, an atomic bomb. Japan's scientific and industrial expertise was inferior to that of the United States. So to summarize, the Russians' immense manpower and industrial might crushed Germany on the Eastern Front. The U.S., Britain, and the Free French combined to drive the Germans out of Western and Southern Europe. The mainland of the United States was never, ever attacked. Our infrastructure was allowed, bomb-free, to build the factories. That great General Motors plant on Union Boulevard was one of the great Air Force airplane manufacturers in the country. Carver Carburetor, so many other plants in this region. We were second only to Detroit as an arsenal of democracy. And the Americans, British, and French were not willing to have conditional surrender, but until it received unconditional surrender from its enemies. Now, the war ends, Japan surrenders September 2nd, 1945. The United States, over the next 10 years, was brilliant, and its allies, but led by us, Presidents Truman and Eisenhower. Instead of crushing and stripping down its enemies, Japan and Germany, we made them democratic countries. We wrote their constitutions. We denazified Germany. We taught patiently the Japanese people how a democratic society can function. We provided millions of dollars, billions of dollars for the rebuild of Europe through the Marshall Plan, and created a network of defense alliances to protect Japan from communist China and Russia and Western Europe through the creation of NATO, the Marshall Plan to withstand the threats of the Soviet Union. Our erstwhile ally during the war had become our Cold War enemy, who ended up getting the atomic bomb 4 years after we did. Part of it was espionage by having spies in Los Alamos, where our nuclear weaponry were initially developed. So, World War II was a watershed. We could not remain isolationist anymore, because who else would rise up besides the Soviet Union to threaten the people of the free world to take natural resources? Where would the next Hitler or Tojo or Mussolini emerge? We, since 1945, through Democratic and Republican administrations and Congresses, we became the savior of the world. I mean that sincerely. With all of our faults, and we have many, the way we treat our own people at times, the way we fight amongst ourselves, our blood, treasure, and spirit, and willingness to fight for freedom saved the world 80 years ago and continues to save the world now. Mason Point, you have been a wonderful audience, and if you have any questions, if I still have a couple minutes, Vi, I would be happy to entertain your questions, and I'm going to lend you guys something. I have a wonderful American heritage pictorial history with great commentary of World War II. Vi, I will be willing to lend this book to Mason Point for as long as there's interest of residents to browse through it. If you have a library, it can be returned at your convenience in a year from now. All righty? So thank you very much. All right. So, any questions or comments? Did anybody have relatives who fought in the war? Wow, so many. And you heard stories from them? Okay. Did anybody learn anything new today that they weren't aware of? I've had some comments about the embargo of the Japanese oil that really helped trigger Pearl Harbor. Ma'am, what did you learn?
I have a question,
Yeah.
and it was about the atomic bomb.
Yes.
For years I thought, oh, what a decision this was for Truman.
Right.
Then I learned more about it and found out that had we not used the atomic bomb, we would have lost 1 million of our military.
Yes.
And I'd like for you to address that.
Yes, I have read lots about that, but I believe totally in that assessment. The Japanese were literally going back to their homeland. They were digging in the Japanese islands, despite the utter destruction of so many of their cities and the like. They were going to fight to the last man. And frankly, your relatives, and probably my father, would have been forced to have gone into an invasion force which was predicted to maybe have 1 million American casualties if we had to invade the Japanese homeland. Truman didn't even know when he was vice president that the atomic bomb was being developed. He was told about it a week after he became president in April of '45. He had to make that decision, whether to drop the bombs on Japanese population centers in August of '45 to hopefully convince the Japanese Emperor Hirohito that war was no longer feasible. That assessment is correct. As terrible as the decision was, Truman and many of his generals felt they had to force the Japanese to realize they were facing utter destruction. Other questions? Comments? Ma'am?
I heard that the Germans were within a short distance.
Yeah.
I heard that the Germans were within months of maybe developing an atomic bomb also when the war was over. Is
Yes,
that true?
they were, before the war ended, they did have technology that was very, very strong. And they were part of an atomic bomb production was using heavy water. And they had conquered Norway. And there was this huge heavy water dam in Norway that American agents and spies had learned about, along with British and Norwegians. And there was literally commando attacks in early 1944 to destroy this plant that the Germans were going to prepare their own atomic missile bomb. Interestingly, though, Hitler never devoted the resources to atomic weaponry. He believed in missiles, conventional missiles, which were those V-2s that were terrible, that became the first guided missiles. Matter of fact, the creator of those missiles, the lead scientist, was a young man named Werner von Braun. And when the war ended, the U.S. and Russia both wanted von Braun. We got to von Braun first and took him, hid him in Florida for a year, and then to Huntsville, Alabama, where the U.S. Missile and Space Program was born. But yes, the Germans were close, but never so close that they could have succeeded, but it could have been a disaster. And part of that was the loss of too many of their top scientists who, under Hitler's gun, probably would have helped them develop it, were they not safely here. Albert Einstein, first among them. Ma'am.
Although we were in the middle of a country, here we had air raid drills, and sirens would sound, and we had to turn out all the lights.
Right.
And the air raid warden would walk the streets, make sure he didn't see any lights.
Wow.
So I experienced that growing up.
Really?
Yep.
You were just a little girl.
I was.
Where were you going to school? Where did you go to school then?
Garfield Grade School and Roosevelt High School.
Wow, you were a Rough Rider. There you go, in South St. Louis. Very good, congratulations. I think we have time for one more question. Are we okay, Jen?
You're good.
Oh, okay. Other questions? Sir. You, sir. Yeah, there's the mic.
How did the war against submarines in the Atlantic proceed?
That took a while.
Okay.
It took technology for us to be able, they were called the wolf packs. Germany had created a terribly effective submarine force that was crippling Allied shipping from the east coast of the United States to Great Britain and the like. But the U.S. Navy, by 1941-42, had created ships with minesweepers that were able to neutralize those submarines that were literally wiping away American materiel headed for Great Britain. And it took a while. And give the British Navy credit for sink the Bismarck. The British sunk the largest battleship ever created to that time, the Bismarck. And that put a major dent in Germany's naval operations, which allowed the Americans and the British to really focus on air power and armaments on land at that point, infantry. But yeah, submarine warfare was in Germany's favor till the middle of 41, early 42. Great question. In the back, sir.
You've mentioned several tyrants that have great plans to conquer large areas.
Yes.
Bring us to today. Anatolia Khomeini wishes to conquer large areas of the Middle East. What's the outcome?
Today? Well, I'm a firm believer in, frankly, the West, meaning the United States and its allies, of maintaining a strong military presence around the world and in the Middle East, to not fight wars, but to prevent them. And that's really the best answer I could provide, there are bad actors that want to take away freedoms that we take for granted of people like you and me, whether they live in Iraq, Israel, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, you name it. Countries big and small around the world. And it's the United States, in my opinion, has to be a continued arsenal of democracy and freedom. Whether we want to be engaged, we can't be the way we were in the 1920s and 30s. And fortunately have the capacity after Pearl Harbor to build an incredible military powerhouse in only 3 years. We don't have that luxury anymore. Too many countries have too much technology to do us harm. And people who cherish freedom as we do. Ma'am?
Do you see any similarities between Putin and Hitler?
Yes, some similarities. Putin is not a madman. He's not, but he is a very bad man. I'll give that difference. Putin glorifies what the Soviet Union was from 1941 till its ending in 1999. And he wants that restoration of the old Soviet Union, which means literally empowering himself in Russia all the way to the old Iron Curtain countries. That includes Ukraine, which was a part of Russia, all the way to the Baltic Sea, including Poland, as an example. However, he recognizes the limitations of his power at this particular point, and he fears a revolution, I'm convinced, amongst his own people. It's not World War II where everybody fought for the state, for Uncle Joe Stalin, Mother Russia, because they had to. They had no choice because the Germans would have exterminated them. Putin knows we don't want to, the U.S. does not want to exterminate Russia. We just want Russia to stay in its sphere and behave itself. Putin recognizes that, but he, like an angry child, will look for every weakness and advantage. And he underestimated Ukraine badly, to the tune of hundreds of thousands of Russians that have been killed, much less Ukrainians. I think the U.S. is playing a very good role. We have not committed American troops there, but we are committing technology, weaponry, and dollars to a democratic country, Ukraine. Forget its past, which wasn't always glorious. They could be very hateful people at one time, but the Ukrainians now value liberty, and they are an ally, and they are strategically located at the Black Sea, which is in America's interest to help protect. But no, Putin is not Hitler, but he is a bad, bad person. And let him just be pushed back to where they were, in my opinion. Other thoughts? All right.
I think we've about reached the time.
All
to
right.
say thank you.
Thank you, Connie.
We look forward to having you.
Well, I would appreciate it. I'll check my calendar. And I got 1,000 jokes, but I've run out of time. All right.